But first, never waste a crisis is political advice. And today, the former Labor Cabinet Minister Joel Fitzgibbon offered his advice on how to turn the potential crisis of a hung parliament into a new reform opportunity for our nation.
That someone will hold more seats than the other. What I've proposed is a pact between the major parties to squeeze out the crossbenchers, particularly those on the hard left, and to ensure that we take this opportunity to have a bipartisan economic plan for the country.
Fitzgibbon's right to fear the chaos of a parliament run by the Greens and the Teals, but because he was there last time it all happened in 2010 and saw the consequent circus. As a warning to voters like Fitzgibbon, I wrote about this too in my column on the weekend. I mean, who can forget this bit of political exhibitionism?
I'm confirming for the Governor-General of Australia that today I'll do what I have always done, ironically, and give confidence and supply to government. And in effect, that means confidence and supply in Julia Gillard.
Oh my God, we do not deserve that again. The hung parliament elected in 2010 was not beautiful in its ugliness, Fitzgibbon says. It was just ugly. And he's right to point out to the big parties the shrinking vote. Now, he thinks it's shrinking, that vote between the two big parties, because that explains the lack of political courage, he says, that's characterised our post-Hawke and post-Howard polity. But maybe it's actually the reverse. It's the lack of political courage that explains the shrinking vote. Maybe it's the failure of the big parties to tackle hard issues, like the failure of multiculturalism, like the rise of the administrative state that's made voters jump ship to minor parties, that because they'll never have to run the country, are better at articulating a grievance than coming up with solutions. Fitzgibbon says that in the event of a hung parliament, the two big parties should agree now to support whichever of them has the largest number of seats.
There's nothing stopping the leader who has the second most number of seats saying to the person who has the most number of seats, look, I'll guarantee you supply and confidence for an 18-month period.
And as he wrote in The Australian today, the two big parties, said Fitzgibbon, should further agree before the election to support, and I quote, an agreed economic and regulatory reform package to be drafted by a roundtable of relevant stakeholders, including the major parties, premiers and representatives from industry and community sector peak bodies. Now, if it all sounds like a bit of a rerun of Bob Hawke's bid for national consensus at the 1985 tax summit, well, that's right, because that's what it is. That was the meeting where the then Treasurer Paul Keating's preference for a broad-based consumption tax was blocked by an economically more cautious PM in Hawke. Now, the GST that we eventually got was out of that because in the case that came later on, John Howard had more political courage than Hawke. Or maybe it's some upscale version of the National Cabinet that Fitzgibbon's calling for, which was good at getting agreement in Canberra, but terrible at making it stick once the premiers got home. So it's on this point that I have to disagree with Fitzgibbon, because this idea that the way to solve our problems is for a whole bunch of fixers to get together behind closed doors in the Parliament and present the electorate with a done deal, well, that's exactly what we do not need right now. Indeed, it's this notion of a uni-party, as people like Nigel Farage call it, where nothing much changes regardless of who's in power, that's at the heart of our present discontents. So while I would implore voters on the left to shift their vote to the right, if they won't or they can't, then at the very least, don't give it to the Greens. But for Liberals to do some sort of pre-election deal with Labor, I'm sorry, Joel, I can't agree. The last thing we need is for Liberals to bow to the Labor left. We need a clear contest, a real black and white choice between the two major parties, not an establishment consensus, because Liberals looking and sounding like Labor is what's been killing us at a state level, and it's why they're so often in almost permanent opposition. Liberals win elections when they are a party of the conservative right, when they offer voters a distinct choice based on values and convictions, when they stand up to the hard left, not when they try and mimic them, Like when Tony Abbott went to the 2013 election with a clear policy to stop the votes, a policy that the Rudd government furiously opposed, that Abbott then put into practice. Now, if you want consensus politics, well, we got it there then eventually, didn't we? When Labor gave up its opposition to open borders and adopted the Liberal policy that worked and that more or less has held to this day. But let's at least give Joel, a decent man who's been a real loss to the Parliament, marks for trying. If he really wants to avoid a hung Parliament, though, his side of politics should do what Peter Dutton's already committed to doing. Put the Greens, the extremist Greens, last on the ballot paper. If Labor's serious about Australia's future, it's got to put the Greens last, as the coalition will do. Because both sides, putting the Greens last and putting forward clear alternative policies that they can actually argue out before the electorate, is what we need going into this election. That's the best way to avoid a hung Parliament and to get better government that our country needs and that voters might respect.